a few things more about the background of this community. When and why did the Qumran community get started? You have to go back to the time of the Maccabees. The Maccabees were a group that fought against the Greek king that was very oppressive. But already the Jews were divided among themselves. The Sadducees were one party of Jews, composed of the priests and the nobles, and they wanted to go along with the Greeks. The Pharisees were a group that were against the Greeks, and they were mostly composed of the laity, and they wanted the law to be strictly lived, while the Sadducees wanted to adapt to the Greek culture. So they did a number of things, like the first book of Maccabees mentions that they wore Greek-style hats instead of turbans like a Jew. And they wore Greek-style clothes, and they had a gymnasium like the Greeks did. And the gymnasium comes from the Greek word gymnos, which means that you're naked. So they would do their athletics with no clothes on. So Jews found that very offensive. So these were some of the tensions that existed among them. And but eventually the Maccabees won in a guerrilla war against the Greeks. The Maccabees then became the leaders, and they began to form their own kingdom, their own commonwealth. And there wasn't a kingdom yet until 142 BC, when the last of the Maccabee brothers declared himself to be both the high priest and the king. Some of the other priests said you can't be both. Either be the high priest or be the king, but you can't do both. And he said, oh yes, I can. And so they said, well, you can't. They said they can't, went back and forth. So finally he said to them, you have to leave Jerusalem. I'll kick you out of the priesthood. Said, you can't kick us out, we're leaving. This became the mentality, okay? And so a group of priests who would not tolerate Jonathan being priest and king came down here to Qumran. This tower already existed. It was built by the kings of Israel probably in the 700s BC, and was a ruin. They came here and they started to build a community center around this tower. And they had a leader that they called the teacher of righteousness. They taught, as you heard in the movie, a lot about the end of the world, that they were going to be part of the people who were victorious against evil. In fact, they were going to be the only ones who were victorious against evil. And they opposed everybody else. Everybody else. So this is, the basis for the community. And what they would do is copy scripture, and they would write commentaries on the Bible explaining their own ideology and what it is that they believe. So that was one of the things that they did. And then they stayed here until there was an earthquake. I forget the year of the earthquake. But there was an earthquake, the community was abandoned for a while, but then they came back. And they stayed here until 68 AD. In 68 AD, the Roman army came from Galilee toward Jerusalem. They came here and they wiped out the community. But before the community was wiped out, they had hidden all of their scrolls in the caves around here. Again, in 11 caves that have been discovered, they hid their scrolls. And so now we have them. These are presently the oldest copies of the Old Testament that we have, by far. The next oldest copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew goes back only to 925 AD. So these are 1,000 years older than the next oldest copy of the Bible. So you can see how they became extremely important for being able to test the authenticity of the biblical text. In my Hebrew Bible, I have on the bottom of the page any variation between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the one from 925. There are very few spelling differences. You can, when you look at them, again, you got to know Hebrew, but when you look at it, you can see why some of the mistakes might have been made, because they sounded just like the other one, but it was a slight difference, or it looked like it. For instance, the R and the D easily get mixed up, and the He and the He also get mixed up. And so there'll be a few letters like that that are close to each other that get mixed up, and they make a little mistake here and there. But other than that, the text is extremely faithful. So it shows that the Jews were very, very careful about how they passed on copies of the Bible. Okay? Now, we already mentioned, they mentioned that John the Baptist may or may not have been part of this community. We cannot prove it. However, I myself tend to think that he was part of the community, partly because in the last verse of Luke chapter 1, it mentions that John was raised in the wilderness. Secondly, he was the son of an elderly priest. And one of the things that the Qumran community did was raise the orphans of priests. When priests had kids and the priest died, then they would raise them here until they were 18. And then they gave them the chance to stay in the community or to leave. Third, the verse that John the Baptist quotes more often than any other from the Old Testament is Isaiah chapter 40, verse 2. A voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Okay? That also happens to be the one verse of the Old Testament that is quoted more often than any other verse in the Dead Sea Scrolls. No other verse appears as often as that. So, you've got that kind of evidence. And finally, John was baptizing less than 5 miles away from here. So, and they also baptized. Now, those are the similarities. There are some significant differences between Qumran people and John. He would baptize sinners. They refused to have anything to do with sinners. They refused to have anything to do with Pharisees, Sadducees, and any sinners at all. Whereas John would baptize the sinners. Now, that is a point where he's similar. The Qumran community considered the scribes and Pharisees to be vipers and snakes. They used the same language about the scribes and Pharisees that John the Baptist uses for them. Exactly the same vocabulary. So that's another similarity. But John would baptize the sinners, and this community would have nothing to do with them. And John saw himself preparing for the coming of the Messiah, while this community believed that it was the coming of the end of the world, and that only they were going to survive. So those are some of the connections and distinctions between the two. And I think that gives a background of why John may well have been part of it, but left. He also was different from them. One last issue: was Jesus ever a member of the Essenes? There is no evidence that he was. As a matter of fact, there is a line in the Sermon on the Mount where it says, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your friends, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. That is a quote from the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is not from the Old Testament. So the Qumran community taught that you love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But the Old Testament and the rabbis never taught that. So he's criticizing the teaching of the Qumran community. He knows it, but he doesn't agree with it. So he's probably not ever a part of this community. That's much less likely than John the Baptist. Any questions?
Yes.
Yes.
How was it Jesus when they called him rabbi? Where did he get his training?
He didn't have training. That's one of the things you see mentioned in the New Testament. They say, where did he get his training? You know, we know that he's a carpenter. So, you know, he's made a rabbi. There was no ordination ceremony. So he's a rabbi by popular acclamation. But he has no training. Yeah.